Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome CCSSO Executive Director Chris Minnick.
Good afternoon. It's nice to see 1,000 of my closest friends here in, where am I? I'm in Austin. There you go. I feel like one of those band members that doesn't know where they are. I want to thank you for being here. We host this event every year. It's the biggest event that we put on as an organization, and it's just an honor to be here and talk about how we can improve assessment for kids across the country. I want to give special thanks to start to Scott Norton, Fen Chow, and Carla Toy for organizing this conference. Please give them a round of applause. I also want to appreciate the chairs of our committee that comes up with the program, Jennifer Stafford of the Kentucky Department of Education and Jennifer Dugan of the Minnesota Department of Education. Please give them a round of applause. And finally, I want to thank ETS for sponsoring this luncheon and their long-term support of this conference. So you heard from John earlier, but I just want to thank ETS. Please give them a round of applause. It's been a hard week for me. We lost one of our members on Monday evening. The commissioner in Massachusetts, Mitchell Chester, passed away after a short bout with cancer. And he was very much involved with CCSSO. He was someone who I could call and talk to about anything. He would come to this conference. He was an assessment and accountability director previously in the state of Ohio. He was somebody that I felt always had kids' interests in his heart, and he was always somebody that I could turn to. This conference, in many ways, represents everything he was fighting for the kids of Massachusetts. He wanted a fair chance for every kid. So if you'll indulge me for a second, I just wanted to share a brief poem. It's called The Dash. It's by Linda Ellis. So I read of a man who stood to speak at the funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on her tombstone from the beginning to the end. He noted that the first came at the date of her birth and spoke of the following date with tears. But he said what mattered the most of all was the dash between those years. For that dash represents all the time that she spent alive on earth, and now only those who loved her know what little that line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash, but what matters is how we live and love and how we spend our dash. So think about this long and hard. Are there things you'd like to change? For you never know how much time is left that can still be rearranged. If we could just slow down enough to consider what's true and real, and always try to understand the way other people feel, and be less quick to anger and show appreciation more, and love the people in our lives like we never loved before. If we treat each other with respect and more often wear a smile, and love the people in our lives like we never loved before. So when your eulogy is being read with your life's actions to rehash, would you be proud of the things they say and about how you spent your dash? Mitchell spent his dash fighting for kids. And I can tell you, as somebody who's known him for about 10 years now, that he made the life of the kids in Massachusetts better. So could we please give him a round of applause for his service to the country? I told my wife I wouldn't make it through it. I did. That's good. Okay. Thank you for indulging me. He's a very important person in my life, so I know we'll all miss him. So it's an honor to be here and talk. I'm going to make some brief opening remarks before we get to John's talk. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about ESSA and what it means for you in the States and what we're seeing across the country. So I'm really excited about the fact we've seen 17 plans, so 16 states and the District of Columbia have been submitted to the Department of Education. 3 of those states have received feedback, and if you've been following, some of that feedback may not be totally consistent with the law. And we're working pretty hard on your behalf as your membership organization to make sure we push back on the feedback and make sure the department is complying with the law as they're giving you feedback. It's a really important thing to listen to feedback, as you guys know. I mean, I can't imagine with all the people in the state giving you advice, and now you have a group of people at the federal level giving you advice, along with a lot of people who want to just give you advice because they think they should. And I know the job is not easy to try to make sure that you write a solid plan for your state. But I think one of the most important things that I would encourage you to think about is writing the plan for your state is so much more important than whether or not what the federal government thinks of that, or even people in your state. If the kids in your state aren't doing better at the end of 5 years, then your plan has not been successful for your state, right? And so there needs to be checkpoints. There needs to be processes that we go through to make sure that we're achieving those goals. But this needs to be about the kids in your state, not what the federal government says, not even what the state government says. And I'm so proud that those 17 plans have really put kids first as part of this process. We're going to hear from John a little bit about, when I'm asking some questions about his feedback for states on those plans. But I think we're at an inflection point in the country where states are going to take the reins, and we're not going to look back, and kids are going to do better because of it. You know, I really do encourage you to consider the feedback from the Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education that you receive. But I encourage at the same time for you to remain true to your state and the vision that you've created across your state. I was in the session earlier about what Oregon has done in terms of stakeholder engagement. If you haven't seen it, you should look at it. It is truly amazing to see the amount of engagement and conversation that's going on in Oregon. They've submitted, and they're one of the states that I think is really leading in terms of the amount of engagement they've had with colleagues across the state. The other thing is that this engagement doesn't stop once you've delivered your plan to the Department of Education. One of the most important parts is going to be when you identify schools or you start helping schools improve. The states need a process for doing that, and it's not going to be decided just from the State Department of Education. I think it needs to be in consultation with the folks who have to do this every day in the ground in your schools across your state. I said this to the U.S. Department of Education recently, and I want to say it to you. The lens in which we hope the department will evaluate plans is based on what is most educationally sound for the students in your state. So you may have seen one of the pieces is that they are considering science a non-academic subject right now, which isn't a punchline, it's a fact. That's what's happening. So, and granted, in the law it wasn't clear, so I think they are trying to read the law as written. So, but we need to help the department understand that as we are going to broaden these metrics, as we are not going to just be about reading and math scores in our accountability systems, we're going to need flexibility to make good choices on that. We're also going to need flexibility to not get it right the first time. I think that's a big thing, and it's very hard when you're in public service to say, we might not get this quite right the first time. But I think if you engage with your communities, engage with your stakeholders, you'll see a process where your students do better because you have better metrics on how your schools are doing. So with that, I just want to say CCSSO is behind you as you guys develop these plans. This should be the first part of a process, not the end of a process. And I think it's really critical that we're there to help you get through these negotiations with the Federal Department of Education, but more importantly, implementing the plan in your states. So with that, I get the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker today. John King Jr. He has unique experience at the local level as a classroom teacher and school principal, at the state level as a state education chief in New York, and at the national level as Secretary of Education, and now the president and CEO of the Education Trust. he may tell this story, but if he doesn't, he's also a student who might not have succeeded without the public education system around him, and he tells a really compelling story about that. John truly believes in an excellent education for all kids and has been a good partner in offering feedback to states to make their ESSA plans stronger as we go forward. Please welcome to the stage, John King.
Good afternoon, everybody. That was very low energy. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here with you for this conversation. I want to thank Chris for the introduction, and I also want to echo Chris's celebration of the life of Mitchell Chester. Mitchell and I were state chiefs together. He was a friend and a mentor, and his example of service and his belief that the work that we do in rooms like this has the potential to contribute to expanding opportunity for all kids was an inspiration to me and will remain so forever. So I just want to echo Chris's recognition of Mitchell's importance to this community and to the country. Where I want to start today is by talking about this as a moment of opportunity. And I want to start on a hopeful note. Now, those who watch cable news regularly may be surprised to hear a hopeful note. But actually, I think there's a reason to be quite hopeful about this moment. We have extraordinary challenges, but extraordinary opportunities. With the new law, with the Every Student Succeeds Act, we have an opportunity to think differently about the role that assessment plays, not only in our accountability systems, but in how we think about instruction and ultimately the goals that we have for our students. We have this conversation at a moment when our student population has never been more diverse. Majority of students today in our nation's public schools are students of color. Majority of students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. Our students are entering a world that is more globally competitive and more multicultural and involves more interaction between different groups of people and between different countries than ever before. All of that creates for us, I think, extraordinary opportunity. We also have a moment to build on progress. Over the last 8 years, we've seen significant progress across the country, culminating in the highest graduation rate from high school we've ever had as a country last year, and because of important work done by educators and students and parents. But we also have this conversation, a moment when we have tremendous urgency about the achievement gaps that we know we face. Despite the progress we've made, it remains true that whether one looks at NAEP scores or state test results or high school graduation rates or college graduation rates or youth employment, we still see significant gaps for our low-income students, for our students of color, for our English learners, our students with disabilities, our homeless students, our Native American youth. And so our work is urgent. And we're here because we believe that what happens in schools can make a difference in the outcomes for students. Indeed, our country, if we cannot successfully educate low-income students and students of color, we have no future as a country. Literally none. It's not just about the future of our economy, it's about the future of our democracy. We must ensure that all students have the opportunity to succeed, and we gather with the belief that schools can be a part of that. That what happens in schools, the expectations and beliefs that we have about what students can achieve, the richness, the rigor, the breadth of the instruction they receive and the curriculum with which they engage, not just in English and math, but in science and social studies and art and music, can impact outcomes. We gather with the belief that the kind of culture and environment we create in schools, creating a safe space for students regardless of race or gender or LGBT status or immigration status or the language students speak at home, that environment that we create can make a difference in students' lives. That access to resources, whether it's early learning or access to advanced coursework or school counselors, that can make a difference in student outcomes. But of course, we gather most significantly today because we believe that the role of assessments in instruction, in accountability, in systems of intervention for students who are struggling can make a difference for student outcomes. So I want to talk today about 8 opportunities that I think we have collectively and that we must seize. One is lots of states in this room have worked very hard on college and career-ready standards over the last few years. That work has been politically challenging. It has been practically challenging as states grapple with how to support their districts and educators. But we have an opportunity now to think about how we make the promise of college and career readiness in K-12 more real by strengthening the connections between K-12 and higher ed. There are states in this room that are working on the idea that we can give assessments in high school that will help us understand whether or not students are on track for credit-bearing courses or whether or not they are headed towards remediation. And we know remediation in college is really a euphemism for high school, for which you will pay college prices. We know that for students, for each additional remedial course they're required to take, the less likely they are to persist in college and graduate. We have the opportunity, as some states are doing, to say, no, let's give an assessment in 11th grade. Let's figure out where students are. Let's use the senior year of high school, right, as an opportunity either to accelerate students by giving them access to college-level work or to address the gaps in their learning and skills so that they are prepared for credit-bearing coursework when they leave. That's an opportunity in front of us that we must seize. Second, we have the opportunity to continue the work to build better quality assessments. That was the promise of the investments that the federal government made in PARCC and Smarter Balance. And whether or not states in this room are using PARCC or Smarter Balance, there is still the opportunity to engage in the very assessment improvement that sparked those efforts. Asking, could we be raising our expectations for the kind of work that students are doing when they take assessments? Can we give assessments that are worth the time that students are giving to take them? Can we give assessments that require students to write and to do problem solving in math, that require students to engage with authentic texts, with rich literature, with high quality nonfiction materials? Can we create assessments that ask students to apply real world skills? Can we create assessments that reflect the values that we hope teachers and principals will bring to instruction? And can we do that in a way that allows us to compare student performance so that we can identify where students are struggling, compare student performance within states and across states? And PARCC and Smarter Balance aspired to answer those questions, but they're not the only way to answer those questions. But answer them we must. And as we do that, we have to ensure that we remain true to the principles underlying the original Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, a civil rights law. That as we gather this information from better quality assessments, we need to still disaggregate. We need to look at the performance of African American students and Latino students, of our English learners and our students with disabilities, and then we need to act on that information. We also have the opportunity, and states like New Hampshire are taking advantage of this, to think about, can we reconceptualize assessments, make them more performance-based? And folks in New Hampshire will tell you that is hard and difficult work, not lightly undertaken, but we have the opportunity to aspire to not just smarter tests, but better tests, better quality tests, better learning experiences for students while they take the test. A third opportunity is to take on the challenge that in too many schools, students take still too many tests. We have the opportunity to work with districts and across our states to ask, can we get smarter? Can we right-size the amount of assessments that we are using in schools? We have the challenge to ask of ourselves and of all of our colleagues, why are we giving this test? Is this test true to our instructional philosophy, and how will we use the information from this test? And we know in too many places the answer is that the test is redundant or unnecessary or not of high enough quality. And when that's true, we should get rid of those. We should hear, and sometimes it's hard. When you have critics, it's hard to hear the truth in the criticism. Well, we should try to hear the truth in the criticism that in some schools, students are spending too much time on assessment that is distracting from instruction, and we can do better. And ESSA gives us tools, actually authorizes resources towards the work of auditing assessments. Organizations like Achieve have built tools to help us inform that work. Fourth, we have the opportunity to think differently about assessments for students with disabilities and English learners. We cannot just say to ourselves, well, we've built an assessment system, now let's retrofit those assessments to address students with disabilities or English learners. No, we should design those assessments with those students in mind. We should ask, how can we build alternate assessments that will help us get good information about students' progress, that will help inform instruction? How can we build assessments for the ELP that will actually give us good diagnostic information about students' acquisition of English? How can we persuade legislators to invest the resources that we need for native language arts assessments so that we can lift up the value of having a native language or home language in which you are proficient, so that we can get a better, more accurate picture of student progress in content areas? It's painful to sit with English learners, as I'm sure many of you have, who describe being locked out of classes they know they can excel in because of the language limitations of the assessments they are given. Access to advanced coursework, equitable access to advanced coursework for English learners often lies on the other side of content assessments that allow them to demonstrate what they know and can do in their home language, even as they continue to acquire English. Fifth, we got to make sure that folks are using the assessments effectively, and we have opportunities to continue to refine that work. A lot of important work has happened, folks in this room have done in states and through PARCC and Smarter Balance, on the reports that go home to parents, on the reports that go to teachers. Right? There's an opportunity to make those reports better, more actionable, to make their delivery faster. But there's also work we need to do on assessment literacy across all sectors, helping parents understand what meaning to make of the information that comes from assessments, helping educators understand what meaning to make of the assessments and how to apply assessment literacy to their own assessment design, and helping students to see what they can learn from the assessments that they experience. And as we do that, I think often of the opportunity that we have in teacher preparation and school leader preparation to build in meaningful assessment literacy. I can recall when I was a first-year high school social studies teacher, my first quiz, and I thought, how am I going to design this first quiz? What should this quiz look like? And although there are lots of strengths to my teacher preparation, we didn't have a course in assessment design. In fact, we'd spend very little time talking about assessments at all. And so, like too many educators all across the country, when I designed that first quiz, I thought, well, what did the quizzes look like that I took in this 10th grade course when I took it? I guess that's what the quiz should look like. Right? We can do better. And so it's incumbent on all of us to partner with teacher and principal preparation programs in that work. It's also incumbent on us to use Title II in smart ways. Now, I know the current administration has proposed eliminating all of the Title II funding for professional development, but I expect Congress to reject that. But when they do, that shouldn't then mean for us that we don't do anything different with Title II dollars. We should ask ourselves, are there ways that we can use those professional development dollars to help teachers get better at using assessments, both the state assessments and their own, to inform continuous improvement in instruction? 6, there's an opportunity to connect the work that we're doing on state assessments to the kinds of assignments that are given in the classroom. We know that what's asked on state assessments influences instructional practice. But we also know that the folks in this room, all of you are leaders in your states and districts around assessment and assignment design. Now, at the Ed Trust, we've done a lot of work analyzing assignments. We gathered thousands of assignments from 7 districts, nearly 6,000 assignments, to look at how those assignments line up to college and career-ready expectations. And you may not be surprised to learn that there was a big disconnect between the work students were doing in the classroom with teachers and the promise of the standards. In fact, we found in English language arts that only about a third of the assignments reflected grade level standards. More troubling than that, only 6% of the assignments required extended writing, even though the districts would say teaching writing was a priority. We found in math, more promising, that about 80% of the assignments reflected grade level standards, but less than 10% required higher order thinking. And only about a third asked students to justify or explain their answers. Right? The work that is happening in classrooms every day, that's where kids' time is invested and teachers' time is invested, and we should see our role as helping to influence those practices, both through the guidance that states give and through the design of state assessments. Seventh, technology. There's tremendous enthusiasm about the promise of technology in assessment. And yes, technology can help us deliver assessment results faster. It can make the distribution and scoring of assessments more efficient. But we have to aspire to more than that. We have to aspire to use the technology to make the assessments more reflective of real-world experiences, tasks that students will need to engage in. That means the assessments delivered online can't just look like the same paper pencil assessment flipped up onto a screen. They have to leverage the technology to strengthen students' learning experience. Eighth, and this is maybe the hardest, so we have an opportunity to level with folks about the real trade-offs that come around assessments. Hard trade-offs, like time. Right? If we say we want students to do more writing, we say we want students to do more problem solving, we say we want students to be able to compare arguments and ideas across texts, all of that performance-based work requires more time. So when we say we want tests to be as short as they can be to accomplish our goals, but we want assessments that are more performance-based, those are in tension. And it's partly our role, right, to help the public, to help policymakers understand that tension and what the trade-offs are. There's also a trade-off around passages. If you'll forgive a little bit of wonky, detailed assessment discussion, but the standards in many states in this room ask for students to build background knowledge and content knowledge. And yet the passages that are used on English language arts assessments are typically disconnected from the grade level standards for science and social studies, the nonfiction passages. That's a choice. And if we want to emphasize the building of systematic background knowledge, right, we should acknowledge that having nonfiction passages that are disconnected from those standards creates a dilemma for educators, points educators towards an approach to teaching reading that's disconnected from knowledge building and vocabulary building. And so we just have to grapple with that tension and be clear about the trade-offs there. A third important trade-off is the question of measuring growth. Now, I'm sure we'll talk more about this question of growth versus proficiency, but a key consideration that folks in this room understand so much better often than many in the general public is that we've designed assessments with lots of questions exactly at or just below or just above the level that we would assert is proficiency. If we say we want assessments that will help us measure growth, particularly for the students who are struggling and the most advanced students, that means many more questions, a time challenge. Or it means adaptive assessments delivered through technology, which means a significant investment of resources. But we can't just talk about growth in the abstract. We have to acknowledge that choosing to emphasize growth has implications for assessment design that require real-world trade-offs. And finally, as a trade-off, we need to make clear to policymakers and legislators that you can't design good assessments on the cheap. Right? That good assessments require an investment of resources. Designing good items requires an investment of resources. Building an item bank large enough to help you reach students at the highest and lowest ends of the performance spectrum requires an investment of resources. And so we must confront folks with that very real trade-off. Let me close with 2 points and then turn to questions. One, a colleague who worked with me in New York asked this morning at breakfast, but what does really good assessment look like? Tell me a time you were in a classroom and you saw an assessment and you were wowed and you thought, that is exceptional assessment. And it took me a moment, because I have to acknowledge, although I visited thousands of classrooms around the country, it's hard to think of assessments that really captured the fullest potential of our conversation today. But one that stood out to me was being in a Project Lead the Way classroom in Western New York, where students were working in a pre-engineering, essentially, course. I think they were 11th graders. Students were working in pairs. and the students were doing computer-assisted design at their respective computers. Now, they would do the design on the computer, and then, when the design was done, they would go in the shop and swap designs. And so your partner would have to build your design, and you would build your partner's design. And I use that as an example because it doesn't look like a traditional test, but it does involve real-world application. It does leverage technology to create a real-world experience for students. And the performance-based value of that assessment is crystal clear. Final point. I have to think about why we do this. I was saying to Chris earlier, the goal here isn't to get your state plan approved by the education department, right? Yes, that needs to be done, and Chris will work with the education department and make sure that that's done in a way that honors the law. But the goal is exceptional learning experiences for students. The goal is closing the gaps that we see in achievement that are a reflection of opportunity gaps. The goal is an equitable education system that is true to America's promise of equality of opportunity. And as Chris said, if not for that, I would not be standing here today. New York City public school teachers saved my life. My mom passed away when I was 8. My dad when I was 12. The intervening period I lived with my dad, who was quite sick with undiagnosed Alzheimer's. Home was this place that was scary and unpredictable from night to night. But school was amazing. School was a place that was nurturing and supportive and engaging and challenging. I had a 4th, 5th, 6th grade teacher, Mr. Osterwell. He had us read the New York Times every day, college and career-ready standards before they were called that. We did productions of Midsummer Night's Dream and Alice in Wonderland. I remember them like yesterday. I was the rose with big red felt petals sticking out of my head. He was the kind of teacher, you finished a book, he was there with the next. You finished a math problem, he had another that was a little bit more challenging. And he showed me, kid at PS 276, he showed me this whole world outside of Canarsie, Brooklyn. This whole world of potential. We went to the museum and to the ballet, and we learned the capital and leader of every country in the world. He gave us a sense of possibility and hope. And I was fortunate, even after leaving his classroom and after my father passed and I moved between schools and family members, I was fortunate to always have teachers who saw hope and possibility in me when they didn't have to. They could have said, here's an African-American Latino male student, went to a New York City public school, family in crisis, what chance does he have? And given up on me. But they didn't. They chose to invest in me and see hope and possibility and see the classroom as a place that could expand my horizons, that could give me access to dreams that I couldn't even imagine. And that's the gift. That's what we're aiming for. That's what the work is about. Yeah, there'll be feedback about state plans. But the work, what gets us up in the morning, the goal has to be about those exceptional learning experiences that make opportunity and possibility available to all students. Thanks for being in that work, and I look forward to our conversation.
That's great. So I know all our partners in the room are excited about you advocating for more resources for assessment, but do you think, so you were in the department for part of the time when we were talking about upgrading assessments across the country. Can you reflect a little bit on that process and sort of, was it successful? Well, I mean, I think it was pretty successful, but what things can we do better? How do we go forward from here?
Yeah, look, I think there are a lot of people in this room who should be proud of the work that they did. You know, I was a state chief at the time that PARCC was launching. I sat with many of you in a lot of meetings, a lot of very long meetings about assessment design, long meetings with higher ed, talking about how to better align K-12 expectations in higher ed. So a lot of good work was done. I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that we protect the progress that we've made. So even if a state isn't using PARCC or Smarter Balanced, there is the possibility of using items that are either part of those banks or look like those banks. There's the opportunity to think carefully about how we do cross-state comparability, which was one of our goals at the outset, so that we have a better sense in each of our states of how our kids are doing relative to other states. So I do think there was good progress made. Two mistakes, I think. One is, I think all of us now are much more conscious of the sense that folks have in schools that there is too much time on assessment. And I wish that earlier on we had committed resources and attention to that question of honing and narrowing the number of assessments, the ones that are high quality. And two is I think still we have not spent enough time on the link between accountability, assessment, instruction, and school improvement, that those all have to work together. And it's easy to talk about them in silos, and I think too often we have.
So the department in their template didn't ask for school improvement to be really spelled out. So states, many of the states didn't submit sort of what are they going to do with their schools after they identify them. So what are the things, like in your new role at Ed Trust, you get to be an advocate and help push states in a good direction. So what are some things that you would be looking for if states were required to submit those plans? Or if they do it in their state, what types of things should they be doing?
Yeah, I mean, the framing question I'd say is, so what's the theory of change behind accountability? And I think too often the theory of change behind accountability has been, we're going to make the list, and if we put a school on the list, the school will get better because it's on the list. And I actually don't think that's right. I don't think the evidence bears that out, that there's really a question of capacity building and doing something differently inside of those schools. And I group that into two sections. One is, so what happens in a school if the school's performing okay on average, but there are groups of students who are struggling? There are a set of interventions we know that help English language learners to improve their performance. There are a set of interventions that we know can be effective with, for example, dyslexic students who would be identified as students with disabilities. So are we putting in place the interventions that respond to those groups of students? And that's in that category of the consistently underperforming schools. But then in our schools that are struggling the most, do we have a whole school improvement strategy that's grounded in evidence? And there are increasing numbers of examples of those. I think about actually one that we funded through I3 called Building Assets and Reducing Risks, a program that was started by teachers and a school counselor in Minnesota, has demonstrated success in randomized controlled trials, and actually got a second I3 grant to scale up. And their tagline is something like, same teachers, same students, different outcomes. And the idea is that by focusing on intervening with students who are struggling, who are missing school, who are not earning credits, who are getting poor grades, by creating faculty time for collaboration, by building mentoring relationships between faculty and students, you can improve graduation rates and outcomes. And so I think it's incumbent on states to spend time now on that question. What are we going to do in these schools that are on the list?
Yeah. And do you think, so if you were back in New York, is state takeover really on the list, or is that like at the bottom of the list, or where would you put that? Because I guess from my perspective, that's a really hard thing for a state to do, run schools. Yeah,
it's one of those things where I think it's a question of how it's done.
Yeah.
We were talking about Mitchell. One of the amazing things that is, I think, a testament to Mitchell's courageous leadership is the work that's happening in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where the district is in a receivership. But the way they interpreted receivership was really to empower the superintendent to support teams of principals and teachers in redesigning their schools to better serve students. It's in some ways a portfolio-esque model in Lawrence, a variety of different school types, but they're seeing very big academic gains, very big graduation rate gains, mm-hmm. and that took real courageous leadership from Mitchell to make that happen.
Yeah. What about, so you had one of the most famous tests in the country in New York when you were there, the Regents exam. So you went down the path of doing Park, and then politics got in the way, and then things happened. What's your reflection? What do you think about that whole thing, right? So the Regents exam is still happening in New York. Mm-hmm. But why was it so hard to change?
Well, a couple things. One is, if you're a New Yorker, I'm sure there's some New Yorkers in the room, you took the Regents exam, your parents took the Regents exam, your kids took the Regents exams. There's a way in which the Regents are deeply embedded in the state culture. In fact, our state board is called the Board of Regents, but if you ask people what the regents are, they don't think of the state board, they think of the exams, right? But they can still be regents exams and use items that look like PARCC or Smarter Balance. And I would argue that one of the things that we did with, I think effectively with some of our Race to the Top dollars was to invest in redesigning the English language arts and the mathematics regents exams to look more like the kinds of things that PARCC is asking for in terms of writing and problem solving. And so I think lots of states have this opportunity to say, we got to match our assessment branding to our state culture, and we may want to have certain questions and tasks that reflect our state history or so forth, but we want to have assessments that reflect college and career readiness, and that's going to look a lot like the kinds of things we see on PARCC or Smarter Balanced or the new redesigned SAT.
Yeah. And you guys leaned in pretty hard on the curricular side with Engage and other things. What do you think the right role for the state is in this formative assessment market? The districts are all buying individual tests and working with some people in this room in a lot of cases. So how do you think the state plays a role in that? I mean, if you look across the country, it's wildly different from state to state. So, what do you think the right role for a state is in that?
I'm not sure there's a one-size-fits-all answer across the states, but two things I would want people to think about. One is there's lots of vendors selling assessments that look just like the summative, and particularly multiple choice items that look just like the summative. What's harder in many schools and for many districts is to have the resources to invest in really good performance-based assessment design. What does a research essay that requires students to analyze multiple primary source documents and craft an argument, what does that look like? What are the right primary sources? What are the right questions? How do we test it out so we use it with students? We know how to tweak it and make it better. That can be expensive. So one thing I think about is there a way that the state can help make it possible for people to do more of that high-quality performance-based assessment work? The second thing I would think about is there a way, and I think Louisiana is doing this, John probably talked about this when he was here, John White when he was here last year. There's a way in which the state can help people sort through the marketplace. Louisiana has done that around curriculum, and some of those curricula have embedded formative assessments. They're not saying you must use X curriculum with the embedded formative assessments, but they are saying, here's our evaluation of which ones are better or worse in terms of alignment to the standards. I think that could be a useful role.
Yeah, good. So you're in a new role now of advocating from the Ed Trust perspective, and that's the perspective you had your whole career anyway, so it's helpful. But as you're looking at the state plans, it's clearly a return to state authority, but what do you think states are getting right, and what are some things that you want to push back on?
Yeah, so I'm excited about some of the indicators to supplement English language arts, math, and graduation rates. Excited that folks are thinking about the role of science, setting aside the issue you raised in the opening.
We'll get that right.
I'm excited that folks are talking about the role for social studies in some states. As a social studies teacher, I care a lot about that. I'm excited that states are looking at chronic absenteeism, which we know is a very strong predictor of students being retained in grade and dropping out of high school. Excited that states are looking at access to and success in advanced coursework. We know those experiences in AP or IB or dual enrollment can make a huge difference in whether or not kids feel like college is for them. I'm excited that states are looking at exclusionary discipline because we know that exclusionary discipline often applied disproportionately to students of color can really get in the way of students' educational success. So that is very encouraging. Two things I'm worried about. I'm worried about how folks are thinking about groups of students. And I know this is an issue. There are probably different perspectives in the room about super subgroups and so forth. But the goal has to be that we don't allow students to be overlooked, that we don't allow students to be invisible. And I worry about systems where you might miss. School's doing okay overall. Even most of the students who fit in a super group are doing okay overall. But English learners are really struggling. And that's important for us to identify and to intervene around. And so certainly that's an area that we're concerned about. And then this point that you raised around school improvement, that people really need, I think, in this next stage of work to flesh out what are they going to do in the schools that are identified.
So just, I want to make sure I understand. So from super group perspective, you have about half the states that have submitted so far using some set of it. You would distinguish between ones that are counting more kids versus ones that are leaving kids out of the system by using that.
Yeah, I think it's both important to count more kids,
Right.
but it's also important to have a strategy by which you're going to avoid through the supergroups, missing groups of students within that category. So for example, we worry that there are some states where their design might result in the performance of English learners being missed because it's being grouped with the performance of low-income students more broadly, and you might miss that category of students. And I think there are smart ways for states to think about this, both in their accountability system design and in their reporting and in their school improvement work, right, in the needs assessment stage of the school improvement work.
Yeah. So on the assessment side, where do you see us in 5 years on state testing? And do you think we're still sort of as states going at it on our own, or where would you like to see us in 5 years?
I mean, I'm actually quite optimistic. I think I think if you look at assessments in states today versus 10 years ago, I think probably everyone in this room would agree that on average, they're better.
Yeah.
They're asking kids to do work that is more reflective of college and career readiness, more reflective of the kinds of things they will have to do after high school. And the information that's getting to teachers and parents is better. So I expect that to continue. I think there'll be more use of technology. We have to make sure people use it in a smart way. I think there will be more coherence with higher ed, particularly as states start to think about, like Tennessee, where they now promise free tuition for high school graduates in community college. That's really helped prompt a lot of conversation between community college leaders and faculty and K-12 leaders and faculty. And I think we will see more innovation on design. It's hard to imagine 10 years from now the annual summative assessment arriving in a cardboard box in shrink wrap. Now, does that mean we're going to have, every state is going to have some sort of quarterly system that rolls up into a summative? I don't know. That might be too ambitious. But I do think there are ways we're going to continue to get better, and that some of the debates that we're having today will seem sort of anachronistic.
Yeah, it's an innovator's dilemma, right? So we figured out how to deliver those things and score those things as they are right now, but we need to push to a different system. But at the same time, what we're doing is delivering for us. So time for one more question. I will preview our plenary tomorrow. We're going to be talking about high school assessment tomorrow. So I'd just love your reflection on how we're doing at high school in terms of testing, and why do we seem to see more pushback in high school than anywhere else? I would argue because it's the kids are more engaged with their own advocacy. But what should we be doing in high school testing? And we'll talk about this for an hour tomorrow, but you have 2 minutes. So
okay. Yeah, maybe I'll just raise some questions. I think we've got to grapple with the question of student motivation. And if high school students are being asked to take an assessment that is not relevant to them or their lives, I think you're going to struggle to get the level of motivation that you would want. So we got to ask, is there a way that the assessment can be more embedded in kids' curricular experience and how we think about their progress through high school, how we think about their readiness for college, and how we use the senior year, all those kinds of questions. A second question is, growth is hard if you're not doing year-over-year assessments. And so are there ways that we can think about growth differently, whether we use the 8th grade assessment and kind of predict a trajectory, whether we use assessment performance in conjunction with course grades and credit accumulation to think about high school progress. I think we've got to be creative around that if we want to be thinking about growth and how schools are doing relative to schools serving similar student populations. And then the last piece is the work on college to high school connections is not just English and math. I think a lot of college science faculty would have significant questions about the items on high school science assessments and whether or not they are really preparing students for higher ed science and for careers in science. Similar around social studies. So I think there's a set of questions we need to ask about that. But I think it's an exciting space and an exciting opportunity. And there are resources embedded in the Every Student Succeeds Act that could support this work. We got to make sure we fight to protect those resources, whether it's Title I dollars or Title II dollars. I guess the last thing I would say, just because I know we're out of time, is I just am so grateful to everyone in this room for the work that you do. I know that it's sometimes not always, when you walk in the room and you say, I'm the assessment person, I'm here to help, that probably does not always result in thunderous applause, but everyone in this room deserves thunderous applause because the work that you're doing is ultimately the work that's going to help us get to excellence and equity as a country.
Great. That's a great way to end. Please join me in thanking John for being with us. One more comment. All right, we have a half an hour break, and you can spend it how you'd like, but there are the exhibits going on the third floor. We'd love to see you there. So thank you, and have a great conference.